Namaskar and good morning. Thank you very much for this most sublime prayer. It is just so in fitting. With today's theme, which is all about how to rise to the level of this prayer. We are now in the last month of this year, December. And December is a very sacred month. First of all, it's the month of Christmas, celebrated by millions of devotees of God all over the world. And for us, devotees of Bhagavan Sri Ramakrishna, Sri Ma Sarada Devi, and Swami Vivekananda, this month is even more sacred because, as you know, Ma Sarada was born on the 22nd of this month. And the direct disciples of Sri Ramakrishna formally embraced sannyasa, or the monastic life, on Christmas Eve. We know what blazing fires of spirituality these great ones were. Jesus and his followers, and Thakur, Ma, Swamiji, and his brother disciples. They are our ideals. They lived spirituality and taught by the example of their lives. Last 2 Sundays, we were treated to 2 beautiful talks by our revered Atmajnananandaji on 2 simple but most important teachings of Holy Mother. One on making the world our own, and the other on forbearance and contentment. As we saw, both of them were as valuable as they were simple and beautiful. Today it is my turn to stand here and give the talk. So today, it being the 3rd Advent Sunday, I thought of devoting this morning to a reflection on some important teachings of Jesus Christ. I would like to place before you a few thoughts on the subject of Jesus Christ and spiritual practice. The announcement on the website says that the talk will be on spiritual foundations in the teachings of Jesus Christ. But if you want to give it a more interesting title, we could call it Building Our Houses on Rock. To quote Christ's own words, because that is what spiritual practice does. Give our lives a rock-solid foundation. Anyhow, we'll come to that. I've chosen a few short sayings of Jesus Christ from here and there in the New Testament, which shed much light on the broad subject of spiritual practice when read together. So let us begin right away. In one place, Jesus says, "Not everyone who says to me, 'Lord, Lord,' will enter the kingdom of heaven, but only he who does the will of my Father who is in heaven." I repeat, not everyone who says to me, "Lord, Lord," will enter the kingdom of heaven, but only he who does the will of my Father who is in heaven. In another place, he says, "Be always on the watch and pray that you may be able to escape all that is about to happen and that you may be able to stand before the Son of Man. And in a third place he says, be careful, or your hearts will be weighed down with worldliness and the anxieties of life, and the day will close on you suddenly like a trap. Read together, these sayings seem to point to something significant. Now, a divine incarnation's words are open to various interpretations. We understand or misunderstand their meaning, their significance, according to our own minds. This is especially true of their words on matters like spiritual practice and following the will of God. So, what is the relationship between the two? Everybody agrees that we have to love God and do His will. But there are people who think that spiritual discipline is not really necessary for that. So, first of all, what is spiritual discipline? We have a fair idea of the four main yogas. But from a psychological point of view, from a purely or a mainly psychological point of view, spiritual discipline is that which unifies all our energies, our thinking, feeling, and willing, and directs them Godward when practiced systematically and regularly. Spiritual discipline is what unifies all our energies, our thinking, feeling, and willing, and directs them Godward when practiced systematically and regularly. Anything that weakens the will or disturbs the emotions, that makes us irrational or unsound, that leads us away from God, has to be unspiritual. It cannot give us an understanding of God's will, let alone enable us to carry it out. On the other hand, spirituality not only helps us understand the will of God, but also enables us to live and act according to it. This spiritual practice has two aspects, a foundational and a structural. You know these things, I'm only giving it some new names, that's all. Foundational practice is for gaining control over the mind, and structural practice is for giving it a Godward orientation. The essence of foundational practice is self-control leading to self-mastery. It establishes us in fundamental moral and ethical virtues, thereby providing our lives with a solid foundation. Structural practice consists of prayer and worship, concentration and meditation, and the like. The purpose of structural practice is to turn the mind Godward for a certain length of time. So, foundational practice gathers the mind from its worldly preoccupations, and structural practice enables us to devote that collected mind to God. The two practices are interdependent and must be carried on simultaneously. If we don't practice self-control, we won't have concentration and meditation. And if we don't practice concentration and meditation, we'll never have self-control. But surprisingly, even among religious people, there are many who overlook the necessity of spiritual practice or who don't appreciate its value. Jesus said, "Love the Lord your God with all your heart and with all your soul and with all your strength and with all your mind. How emphatic these words. Love the Lord your God with all your heart, with all your soul, with all your strength, with all your mind. And love your neighbor as yourself. So, people who don't think much about the necessity of spiritual discipline, these people care more about the last part of the teaching. Love your neighbor as yourself. They want to do good to others, to do something for the welfare of their fellow beings. They believe in what is called the social gospel. On the other hand, we have those to whom the first part of the teaching is more important. To love God with all one's heart and soul. So their emphasis is on the so-called daily devotions and spiritual exercises. They are interested in their own spiritual life without much thought to their neighbors. They forget the second part. But if you ask them what they mean by love of God, their answers are mostly vague and unsatisfactory. Love of God implies continuous, unbroken thought of God. We know what love is. When we love someone, we constantly think of that person in various ways. It is not a passing fancy or a mere liking for that person. In genuine love, the whole heart and the whole mind spontaneously and uninterruptedly flow to that individual. There is both emotional fulfillment and intellectual understanding in that experience. So, talking about love is not enough. Love of God is not enough. One needs to cultivate that kind of ceaseless thought of God and experience that inner joy and satisfaction, a joy that is not broken by anything, that doesn't shake in the presence of temptations. To be able to really love God, one has to be absorbed in Him. Our ordinary human love wavers. There is no permanent fulfillment in it. It is only in the love of God that all our feelings and emotions can be fully satisfied forever. There, the entire personality is unified and absorbed in the intensity of divine love. And that not only gives the highest fulfillment, it also makes one aware of God's presence. This is what we see in the lives of saints. But attaining this kind of all-absorbing love of God is extremely rare. All of us here are no doubt interested in God and spiritual life. We've all been trying to live a spiritual life for many years now, perhaps decades. Still, how many of us can think of God so deeply and so constantly as to find joy and satisfaction in Him? How many of us are able to always feel His presence? We are still too restless for that. And why are we restless? Because we are also worldly. We love many other things in addition to God. God only happens to be one of the many things we love, which means we don't love God with all our heart and soul and strength and mind. That is why the mystics and saints who know something about divine love, who have experienced divine love, have devised certain methods of cultivating it. it is possible to develop and manifest that love of God. We already have it within us in a potential form. Our very emotional nature indicates that we have it. But it is so confused, so mixed up with egotism and selfishness that it appears as something altogether different. When we love people, deep down we are actually impelled by this pure love within. Unfortunately, the lower self steps in and changes the whole color of this love. That is what makes the difference between human affection and divine love. Human love is polluted by worldliness and directed towards human or worldly objects. Divine love is uncontaminated by anything worldly and directed solely towards God. Love is of three types. In the lowest form, the lover always demands from the beloved. The whole attention is given entirely to himself. His emotional responses are all egocentric. Because of his selfish attitude, the lover is the center of attention. He expects the beloved to conform to his own likes and dislikes, to please him in every way. In a higher form of love, we have reciprocity, mutuality. The lover gives thought and attention to the beloved, but he also expects the same in return. He is not happy only with getting love, but he is also eager to give his own heart to the beloved. The spirit of demand is tempered by the spirit of giving. Selfishness is minimized to some extent by selflessness. And in the highest form of love, the lover finds fulfillment just by pouring out his love to the beloved. He doesn't consider himself, nor has he any thought of getting something in return. His heart is full when he is just giving. He expresses his love in the form of service and is prepared to sacrifice everything for the sake of love. Because he is totally unselfish, there is absolutely no trading or shopkeeping there. This we know from Swamiji's Bhakti Yoga. Now, each of these three types of love can be directed either to a human object or to God. In fact, these three forms of love do find expression also in human relationships to a greater or lesser degree. But lovers of God should aspire only for the third type, although very few, even among them, can attain it. Most of us approach God, of course, with faith and devotion. We approach God constantly asking for this and that. It's a kind of spiritualized worldliness. Very few see God and God alone. Very few can see God and God alone. Most of us are only interested in the good things that God can give us. So, for people like us, it is necessary to follow some method formulated by mystics and saints in order to cultivate these higher forms of love. What we call spiritual practices are, in fact, meant for the development of this higher love, this divine love. There is nothing mysterious about them. They have nothing to do with pleasing God so that He gives us what we want from Him. They are purely ways of thinking of and loving God and God alone. Jesus Himself practiced the path of love and taught it to His disciples. Take, for instance, his parable of the 10 virgins. He says, 5 of them were foolish and 5 were wise. When the bridegroom arrived, the virgins who were ready went in with him to the wedding banquet, and the door was shut. Jesus warns that only those who are watchful and vigilant in their spiritual practice can be in God's company. Those who are lazy and careless in their spiritual life miss the goal. Therefore, he says, therefore keep watch, because you do not know the day or the hour. Then we have the famous story of Martha and Mary. When Jesus went to visit them, Mary sat at his feet listening to what he said. When Martha complains that she is having to do everything alone, he says, Martha, Martha, you are worried and upset about many things, but only one thing is needed. Mary has chosen what is better, and it will not be taken away from her. So these are all ample indication that we need to first love God before we can think of helping our neighbor. We need to know God before we can do His will. Otherwise, it'll be like putting the cart before the horse. I mentioned people who think spiritual practice is not necessary and that it is enough to do the will of God. But how are we going to know what God's will is? There are people who imagine that they get God's guidance or can understand God's will when they just sit perfectly calm and peaceful and leave their minds open and receptive to what God alone knows. As if it's all that easy. Generally, when one sits still, the mind only appears to be quiet. Very soon, bubbles from the hidden layers of the mind rise to the conscious level. Subtle thoughts or emotions that one is inclined to make their appearance. Then, if the mind happens to be weak or impure, it is likely to deceive itself into believing that those thoughts are the voice of God. And that is dangerous to oneself and to others. It is extremely hard to know what God's will is and what it is not. Great harm has been done by religious fanatics who claim to know God's will. It is impossible to match their claims with the violence in their hearts. The moment we see a person or religion expressing hatred in God's name, we can be sure that they have not only not understood God's will, but in fact have violated it. Any person who flouts basic humanity, any religion that destroys peace and harmony in human society, cannot be doing the will of God. Mutual hatred and obedience to God's will are totally inconsistent. That is why thinking people find it impossible to accept certain narrow interpretations of the will of God. Even religious attitudes and actions have to be morally justifiable. So, though everybody would like to act according to God's will, very few can demonstrate that they have an understanding of it. Too often, people and organizations misinterpret their own imaginations, their own motives as the will of God. So, what are we to do? In order to know God's will, we must first cleanse our minds. Blessed are the pure in heart, for they shall see God. Unless the mind is purified, ambitions, prejudices, and subconscious urges will all come between us and the will of God, which is then interpreted in terms of these things. That is why the mind has to be first cleansed and purified. That is the precondition for understanding God's will. St. Paul himself says, "Be transformed by the renewing of your mind. Be transformed by the renewing of your mind. Then you will be able to test and approve what God's will is." But again, there are good, religious people who believe we don't have to go through spiritual discipline as such in order to purify ourselves. As long as we keep doing good to others, our deeds are enough to purify us. That may be partly true, but the problem is it is not so easy to do good to others selflessly. A little self-examination will show how much our actions are influenced by subtle desires and ambitions lurking in the mind. We are not as pure and selfless as we imagine. The ego camouflages our urges, drives, and motives in such subtle ways that we hardly suspect it of any mischief. So, until the ego is completely purified, we can hardly differentiate between our will and God's. Whether we like it or not, it's a psychological fact. It's a psychological fact that all too often we deceive ourselves and we are not even aware of it. We hear of so many social service projects, all supposed to be God's work, ending in failure or worse. Why? People set about serving others with the best of intentions, but very soon the ego takes over and begins to assert itself. And that gradually ruins all prospects for real service or spiritual development. The path to hell is paved with good intentions, as the proverb goes. There may be instances where the work objectively, outwardly grows and expands. But when the spiritual element is lost, it becomes quite clear that it was all self-love masquerading as love of neighbor. That kind of work has little to do with service or spirituality. That is why we must be careful about this so-called following the will of God or carrying out His purpose. We need to first purify our minds and cleanse our hearts. Sri Ramakrishna also was very clear on this point. First God, then the world. Only then can we hope to understand what His will is. Even Jesus spent 40 days in intense prayer and communion with God before He began preaching. That is enough indication that such practices are absolutely essential for self-purification, for understanding the will of God and carrying out His purpose. So we see that spiritual discipline is indispensable. Only with its help can we apply the whole mind to God so that it can think of Him consciously and constantly. As we persevere in our practices, love and devotion develop within, giving us an unbroken awareness of God's presence. And that fills our heart with much joy and satisfaction. This is what spiritual practice does. It trains the mind so that it can think of God. There is not one mystic or saint who will disagree with this, who will minimize the importance of spiritual discipline, who can show us an easy shortcut to God. Imitation of Christ is extremely difficult. Therefore, systematic spiritual practice is an absolute necessity, and for several compelling reasons. For understanding and assimilating the teaching, for purifying the heart and cleansing our vision, for unifying our thoughts, words, and deeds, to discover the limits of our ego and make the descent of divine grace possible, for developing devotion, for preparing the body-mind system for spiritual practice, and even to enjoy our spiritual discipline both inside and outside. Let's go through it once again. For understanding and assimilating the teachings, for purifying the heart and cleansing our vision, for unifying our thoughts, words, and deeds, to discover the limits of our ego and to make the descent of divine grace possible, for developing devotion, for preparing the body-mind system for spiritual experience, and even to enjoy our spiritual journey. Then, Jesus laid great stress on loving God with all our being, which involves knowledge and awareness of God. Without knowing Him or feeling His presence, it is not possible to have that kind of love for Him. The aim of spiritual practice is perception of God, and the result is divine love. These two are interdependent in spiritual development. A devotee cannot love God without being aware of God, or be aware of God without loving Him. This is what we see in the lives of all great mystics and saints. As their knowledge of God increased, their love for Him also grew, and vice versa. These are two phases of the same spiritual growth. Then we also see another natural consequence of their experience of God, and this is also important. The God that they see within themselves, they also begin to see in others. And when they reach this stage, they serve people as if they were worshiping God Himself. This is the kind of transformation that experience of God brings about. And nobody can rise to this level without undergoing rigorous, systematic spiritual discipline. As we just heard, Jesus Himself found it necessary to go through spiritual practice in order to attain love of God, to understand His will. Otherwise, He wouldn't have prayed in the wilderness or communed with God or taught His disciples to follow Him. As you know, He gave the Lord's Prayer to His disciples. Our Father in heaven, hallowed be your name. Your kingdom come. Your will be done on earth as it is in heaven. And so on. Before He began His spiritual ministration and after the Last Supper, on both occasions, He remained in prayer and communion with God. When He saw the disciples sleeping, He warns them, "Watch and pray so that you will not fall into temptation. The spirit is willing, but the flesh is weak." So, all these things show that unless we undergo systematic spiritual practice, we easily succumb to human weaknesses and make ourselves unfit for higher life. Going through the exercises half-heartedly or mechanically will not change us much. The saints who followed Christ's teachings in letter and in spirit were extremely careful in the matter of spiritual practice and laid great stress on sincerity. Jesus knew our human frailties all too well. That is why he cautioned his disciples and made it clear that spiritual practice is absolutely necessary for right conduct and right action. An incarnation of God doesn't do anything that is not meaningful. He comes to set an example and finds it necessary to go through these practices himself. Otherwise, he wouldn't have done that. His actions are purposeful so that we may follow in his footsteps. In olden times in the East, they always evaluated a school of philosophy from its practical value. They didn't consider any system worthwhile unless it proved that it could change a person's life. And in India, religious leaders had to demonstrate in their own lives that their religion was practical and useful. Their religion had to prove that it could lead one to the ultimate goal of human life. Not only that, these had to be evident also in their disciples and followers. Otherwise, mere ideas and theories were not taken seriously. We see that Jesus fulfilled all these conditions. He demonstrated his religion in actual action through prayer, communion with God, and service to humanity. And he has shown through successive generations also that these practices are helpful and practical, that they are methods of training the mind and purifying the heart, so that people like us can understand and follow the will of God. And that through such understanding and following, work out our own salvation and do good to the world. This is exactly what Swami Vivekananda also taught. Atmano mokshartham jagadhitaya cha. So, from the way Jesus lived and taught, we find that he was a thoroughgoing teacher. Then his disciples and followers in their turn also introduced the same practices into the whole Christian church. So it was not just for the sake of keeping up tradition. This is how prayer and communion with God became the main features of Christian spiritual practice. Prayer binds God and us together. Through prayer, we establish contact with God. So, one who wishes to do the will of God has always to be prayerful. In fact, such a person's life itself should be one continuous prayer. And it is mainly through prayer that one can remain in communion with God. This is the reason why the mystics evolved such elaborate and systematic methods of prayer, contemplation, and communion. They are all intended to arouse and to sustain the thought of God. There is so much meaning behind it all. So we see that it is not easy to practice the so-called social gospel, doing good to others, without adequate preparation. Doing the will of God is the highest expression of spirituality. I may profess to be following Christ, but I may just not be equipped to serve my fellow beings in the spirit of worshiping Christ, because that is the very last stage of spiritual development, seeing God everywhere. On the contrary, I harm and destroy the very people I claim to serve. How can that happen? It is not that I don't understand the teachings. My brain is sharp enough, but my heart is crooked. It is not at all pure. My impure ego twists and perverts everything to suit my own selfishness. It is because I haven't unified my thoughts, emotions, and actions. And without spiritual practice, it is impossible to unify these three. My hidden motives subtly manipulate my thinking, feeling, and willing, and the resulting action is very badly affected. This impure, selfish ego is the biggest block in my expression of love. So anything based on it is sure to collapse, at least in the spiritual sense. In Christ's own words, which I referred to at the beginning, a foolish man built his house on sand. The rain came, the streams rose, and the winds blew and beat against that house, and it fell with a great crash. In the same way, the magnificent institutions that we build also suffer the same fate. It is all right as long as the winds do not blow. Then we can talk as we please. But when the test comes, we have no strength to follow God's will, because our thoughts, words, and deeds haven't become one. Our character is not rock solid. Then we act in positively unspiritual ways against the will of God. All these pitfalls and dangers can be avoided if we are alert and watchful in spiritual life. As we already heard, spiritual practices are meant to help us give a higher turn to our natural urges and emotions, to help us establish a loving relationship with God, and through that, an understanding of Him and His purpose. Unless we have seriously struggled with our emotions, we will have no idea of their real power. When we try to control them and direct them along higher channels, only then do we realize what effect that struggle has on the development of character and willpower. Unless the emotions are unified, the will does not become one-pointed and strong. And without a strong character and a strong will, no high ideal can be translated into actual life. As I said, even in order to really love our neighbors and help and serve them, we need to first purify our emotions and strengthen the will. That is to say, we must be able to refuse the demands of our lower self, the selfish ego, and that takes willpower. If we don't have that power, we will give in to the lower self and give up our higher ideals. This is bound to happen. In fact, this is the truth behind all spiritual degeneration, inner weakness. So, if we want to reach the true goal of human life, we have to take up some form of spiritual exercise. That and only that can purify our heart and strengthen our mind. Now, before I conclude, one last word about spiritual practice. Spiritual practice can be of many different kinds. We need not have a narrow view of it. There is no one method or procedure. Anything that gives a Godward orientation to our life, provided it is practiced consciously, intensely, and regularly, automatically becomes a spiritual discipline. I repeat, anything that gives a Godward orientation to our life, provided it is practiced consciously, intensely, and regularly, automatically becomes a spiritual discipline. This is the Hindu view. As many minds, so many paths. We don't see any kind of narrowness in the saints, Hindu or Christian or Muslim. They all followed their own individual methods, which were quite different from one another's. But in the end, they all arrived at the same God. Of course, they followed their chosen paths with single-minded devotion, but none of them ever claimed that their path was the only path or the best path. Nor did they ever claim to have understood God's will. It is only those who have no idea of God who seem to be sure of what God's will is. There's a Dutch proverb that says, "Beware of the man who knows what is good for you." Yeah. Every day, we are seeing that kind of narrowness and fanaticism is becoming more and more unacceptable in our present-day world. Everybody has a right to follow their own path and has the liberty to do it. This is being recognized more and more. This is how spiritual culture grows and expands. It may not be very obvious, but that is what it is. That is what is actually happening today. People may be walking away from religious institutions, but an ever-increasing number of them are sincerely trying to find their God in their own way, in the freedom of their own homes and groups. More and more people are turning to spirituality, practicing spiritual exercises, and finding meaning and fulfillment in spiritual life. All this is bound to show effect in the real world in the near future. It is all happening as Swami Vivekananda foresaw. If this is how it has to happen, this is how it will happen. Who is to say? Maybe that is the will of God. Thank you. Thank you very much for coming and attending this meeting. Now I have a couple of announcements. Next week, 22nd, Sunday the 22nd, we will be observing Holy Mother's birthday, and this time both the birth date and the tithi coincide, so it will be again on 22nd. It will be on a Sunday, luckily. So everybody can take part in it. Puja, special puja will begin at 11 o'clock in the morning. And the following Tuesday, 24th is Christmas Eve, and the program will be after evening arati at 7:30. There will be carol singing and some readings. Please, you're all invited to come and take part in these functions. Thank you all, and now I invite everybody to join us in the basement for some light refreshments. Thank you again.